Okay, let's pray.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, Lord, ever present, fill us all things, treasure good things, and giver of life, from the wellness of us all purity, and save our souls, O good one.
Okay, so we did last week 5 and 6, right?
I believe so.
Chapters 5 and 6. That's good because I prepared for 7 and 8. Well, by I prepared for 7 and 8, I prepared for 7.
7's much longer though.
It's much longer, and yeah, 7 is much longer. So here we're kind of shifting into really the second half of this epistle, where so the first half he's dealing with the major moral failings in the church in Corinth, which is, you know, the pride and the sectarianism and the sexual immorality that are causing major issues. Now he's dealing with questions that they have asked him, that are also, I mean, very many of these are moral in nature, but also some of it is like how to serve the liturgy, how to do various other things. So here we see he's dealing a bit more directly with their own questions instead of dealing with their own sins. And 7, you get a lot of really, I think, very often misunderstood scripture, very misunderstood comments from St. Paul. You get a lot of crazy views from it. So we'll try and avoid those things. But here he talks a lot about sexual immorality within a marriage, right? How do we handle relations between a husband and a wife, and all of these things, which is very important. It's very important for us, especially in today's day and age. I think we're probably more similar to the as an entire nation to the single city of Corinth than we realize. I mean, it's we are a nation of decadence, and that decadence very much leads to a lot of carnal living, and so this stuff really speaks to our own experience and how it is we can how we can navigate that. So who wants to start reading? Start with 7 verses 1 through 7.
So clockwise.
Sure.
Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband gratitude to his wife, the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. This is wonderful. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves through fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that.
All right, so there's a lot there. Does anyone have any thoughts about what we just read immediately, or comments or concerns?
Oh man. You try to contrast the lack of self-control with thinking that you own yourself.
To some degree, yes. So he really is presenting a very radical, at least to the Corinthians, understanding of marital relations, right? So first of all, he outlines that there are kind of two paths, and one is higher than the other, and those two paths are the celibate life and the married life, right? The celibate life meaning, and both ultimately have the same aim, as union with God, and this monasticism in marriage, right? And so the union with God in monasticism is a more direct union. It is yourself and God. It is a struggle in that way. It is very difficult. It is filled with temptations, whereas as well, there are temptations in the married life, but it's a mediated union with God. Does that make sense? God is using the love between a husband and a wife to be an icon of that love of God and man. So that's a way in which we can touch on that love. But even then, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's just because it is the lesser way, as St. Paul says, it does not mean that the result is going to be different if it's done right. Or St. Paisios, for example, of Mount Athos, he says that he kind of flips the script a little bit. He says that the monks become monks because they simply can't handle they can't do what it takes to actually live a Christian life and be married. He says that those who live a married life and attain the heavenly kingdom are like the martyrs in that they have learned to die to themselves far more than any monastic has. So it's not easy, right? It's not an easy life. Neither way is easy. But, I think what St. Paul here is saying is that, and we get to this a little bit later, the married life brings you a lot closer to the world and with concerns of the world than the ascetic life, the solitary life does. Does that make sense? So there's that. That's one thing that he's pointing to, which was kind of unheard of in Roman society. The other thing that he's pointing to is, and this is something that is often misunderstood, there's this kind of common misconception nowadays where Christianity was somehow oppressive or subjected women, when in reality it was like liberation for women from this Roman form of tyranny. Effectively, in the Roman system, in the pagan world, the wife was effectively the property of the husband, and it was unacceptable for her to ever basically practice any sort of asceticism. It was effectively, she had no say in the marriage, and so this was a serious issue, and the man could basically go where he wanted and do what he wanted. Male infidelity was not really viewed as a thing, which is a serious issue, obviously. And so here, what St. Paul is saying, he starts in this with showing the responsibility of a man in marriage, in Christian marriage, where he says, right, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. So here he's presenting to those in Corinth an understanding that in Christianity there is no difference in the standard that the husband and the wife are called to live. They are both called to serve each other and to give themselves entirely to each other, and that's not something that they can give to somebody else. Right, in the Roman world, the man could go and sleep around, and that was fine. But if the woman tried to do that, she'd be kicked out. And in Christianity, that's simply not the way it is. It's both are held to the same standards in terms of morality, in terms of how we are to behave. So this is a completely like world-changing notion that's being presented here. I mean, St. John Chrysostom talks about this. He says that the bond between a husband and wife is the bond that keeps a society together, right? So how a marriage operates very much determines how an entire society operates. And what St. Paul here is presenting is a completely different way of understanding marriage that completely changes society. And that's why Christianity effectively took over the Roman Empire, was because it was presenting a way of relations between a husband and a wife that was so much more conducive to salvation, to flourishing, that the old system simply did not have a chance, had no chance. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. And then he's also presenting this a very important thing here. And Saint Theodoret of Cyrus, or not Saint Theodoret, sorry, just Theodoret. He says that the Corinthians were asking Paul whether it was right for lawfully married Christians, once they were baptized, to enjoy sexual relations with each other. Paul answered by praising chastity, condemning fornication, and allowing conjugal relations. Right. So it is not a sin for a husband and a wife to engage in sexual relations. Right. This is something that the Lord blessed in the garden when he created Adam and Eve. He told them to be fruitful and multiply. This is something the first miracle that the Lord performed was the blessing of the wine, the turning of the water into the wine at the wedding of Cana. And this very first act that the Lord did was revealing that marriage is blessed by God. But because the Corinthians were so warped in their thinking, as we talked about last week, right? They were dealing seriously immoral things like incest, things like that. They very tempted to go to the other extreme, which was that all sex is bad, like all marital relations are bad. This is wrong. And so once we get baptized, that's it. We're done. We're living as brother and sister. And St. Paul here is saying, no, that's not true. There is a place for that. There's a place for living as brother and sister, right? But what is kind of the premise here that St. Paul is saying? What must that be?
Well, for the sake of prayer.
For the sake of prayer, but yes, but how is that decided?
Yeah.
Consent. It's a mutual decision,
Right.
right? One spouse can't simply say, all right, we're fasting now. Like, we're done.
What did
like-
John of Kronstadt do?
He did do that.
Yeah,
That's
it was-
exactly
it was
what he did. And I was going to bring that up. So St. John of Kronstadt, he, on his wedding night, do you guys know this? So he, on his wedding night, so him and his wife have the wedding ceremony. It's great. It's wonderful. And then as they enter into their bridal chamber, he informs her that there are enough happy couples in the world and there doesn't need to be one more, and explains that they are going to dedicate their lives to God and live as celibates, which his wife naturally was not very pleased to find out. So that the whole premise here is that what St. Paul is saying is you don't defraud the other. So she took him to spiritual court and
Right.
tried to get a divorce. Now, what is unique about St. John's position, because it is a unique position, he had received revelation that this was his calling, right? That it was his calling to live in this way, that he was going to have such a powerful ministry that he had to serve the liturgy daily. He had to nourish himself with the liturgy every day, and he knew this, and so he recognized that. No, he informed her on her wedding night, and so she tried to divorce him. But as she was on her way to the spiritual court, the Mother of God appeared to her and explained to her the situation, and then she learned to accept it. Right, so she recognized it was divine revelation, and she ultimately consented, and they had a very good marriage. Now it was a marriage of celibacy, but it was a very good marriage. There's other instances of this. There was one, the Lives of the Saints, I think it was this week or last week. And it was actually a very similar situation where they get to the wedding chamber and the husband said, now before we have relations, I would like to read a biblical passage to you. And they read this one. And he said, now what do you think of that? And she said, I think we should give away our possessions. And they both became ascetics.
Okay.
They both became
This is more by the
monastics.
book.
And I think Father Gregory gave a homily about it last year, how this was the ideal marriage, because they both became monastics in separate monasteries. But then as the man decided he wanted to go to the Holy Land, I need to figure out who these people are. I can't remember their names for the life of me. But he decided he wanted to go to the Holy Land, and his spiritual father blessed him. And as he's traveling, an unknown monk came and asked if he could join him, and they would not say a word. They would not speak a word to each other outside of this conversation. They would simply spend their time in unceasing prayer and go venerate the holy places. And he agreed. And so they spent their entire time in silence, venerated the holy things, and came back. Now, unbeknownst to him, it was his wife who had been so strict in ascesis that she was unrecognizable, and she was dressed as a monk, as a man. And so when they get back, his wife says, we should continue to live like this. And he talks to his spiritual father. His spiritual father sees the way they were living, how they lived in total silence. And he said, that's a great idea. And so they lived in a cell together in total silence and unceasing prayer for the entirety of their marriage, and she died. And Father Gregory says, now that is the perfect marriage. But it's really a beautiful thing. I mean, that's they lived in such a way that they were truly angelic. And that really shows, I mean, through the lives of the saints, it's evident that way of life is indeed possible. And that was a very common way of life back in the day. I mean, you would have your kids, you would raise your kids, and then the husband and the wife very often would go into the monastery.
Right.
The one would become a monk, one would become a nun, but it has to be a mutual kind of thing, right? You don't see it too often nowadays. Usually something like that happens. It's kind of a force of hand, right? So like certain bishops were married, but their wives died. Right. So it's they became monastics after that happened. So, there's that kind of thing. But ultimately the point is that these kind of acts of asceticism, they have to be done mutually, of mutual agreement, right? So it's important. One person can't simply decide we're going to be ascetics now and we're going to fast all the time or whatever. That has to be something that's decided between the husband and the wife. And ideally, Lord willing, you have good communication, because that's something that needs to be communicated. So, and that's what St. Paul is ultimately saying. But then he's also reminding them that it is the better path is the path of chastity, of celibacy, because then you can devote yourself to prayer, right? And that's why we have monasticism as a model as we go to the monastery for guidance very often. We're blessed where we live. We have so many monasteries by us. We're almost surrounded by monasteries, which is wonderful. But we can go to the monasteries and see how the monks live, and they are for us very much a model for how we live our own lives. Very often when we go to the monastery, we see our own failings before us. We see things we don't do, and then we recognize, okay, there's where I need to repent. And the monks and nuns are very gracious in that way. So,
St. Paul's also warning us, though, that most of us are too weak.
yeah.
Is that a fair way of taking this?
Yeah. He's this is not the path for everyone, right? Monasticism is not for everyone, most people. And that's why monasticism has traditionally been a minority movement within the church. Now, there are times in which that's different, right? Like St. Athanasius the Great, he said that at his time, about half of the Christians in the world were ascetics. He said that the deserts became as populated as the cities. He said they became the new cities. So like the Thebaid, which is now like a desert, once again, was what had more people in it than Alexandria, because the people were just fleeing to the desert to become monastics. But that's a very unique time. It's a very unique time in the history of the church. That's not something that you find normally. And then you have certain, kind of anomalies in the Christian world, one being Romania, Father Roman Baraga, who reposed in Rives Junction at the monastery there, but he was a monastic in Romania for most of his life before he was imprisoned by the communists. He talks about how Romania is unique in the Orthodox world because it really is it's effectively a monastic state, where there is such a large percentage of monastics in Romania as opposed to anywhere else. It's really a unique thing, and that really shows in the general piety of the Romanian people. I mean, they're an incredibly pious nation, incredibly pious people, and that is, I believe, directly attributed to the prevalence of monasticism in their society. The monks are there, people interact with them all the time. That is something. Being close to monastics and being close to monasteries is only a positive thing. It's incredibly wonderful. So this is all just a shameless plug. We should all go to the monastery, which is good. There's one. Have any of you been to the Dormition Convent, Rives Junction? Highly recommend it. It's actually a Romanian monastery. The women's monastery there. There's about a dozen, maybe a little more nuns. Really wonderful place.
You're serving there sometime in November, right?
Yeah, in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So I'll be there in 3 weeks. Our church school does a pilgrimage there in the spring and in the fall. So it is going to be, Vladika is going to be visiting us second week in November, and I'll be there the third week. So, and then I also serve there I fill in whenever Father John is gone. Not always, but there are times in which I do that. Okay. So anyways, moving on. So it's really wonderful. Go to the monastery. It's really good. I have other things written down here as well. Archbishop of Araki commenting on this, he says, a wife and husband belong to each other completely and do not even have authority over their own selves. This means that abstinence from marital relations is allowed only in cases of mutual agreement, like we talked about. This is a mutual decision, right? Okay, so let's go to verses 8 through 9. Elizabeth, you want to kick us off there?
But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burden with passion.
This is a very, very important and also very dense passage. So Theodoret of Cyrus, he comments on this as well. He says, what he means is something like this. It is better for both of you who have not had a taste of marital intercourse and for you who have been enjoined in marriage but separated by death to opt for abstinence. But if you cannot bear the onset of passion and instead are in a weak condition of soul before this contest, lacking an ardent an ardent zeal for good, no law keeps you from marrying. That's a very important concept, right? This is something that is the church has always blessed remarriage under certain circumstances, right? Second and third marriages, the most common being death, right? If your spouse dies, and your children are of a certain age, it is permissible for you to remarry. There's a certain gap. There's a certain point in which that cuts off. But yeah, what St. Paul here is saying is it's ideal if your spouse dies for you to remain in abstinence, for you to remain in asceticism, but that's not always possible, right? In this case, that he gives, it's better to marry than to burn. If you still struggle with carnal passion, it is better for you to get married in that case. There are also other instances in which it is like permissible. Like, for example, if you have young children, it's incredibly difficult to raise young children alone and to work a job and to support them. So these are all things that need to be considered, right? So it's the ideal, as he says, it is to be abstinent, but that is not always possible. And there is a permission for that. The church has always allowed that. The church has always allowed for remarriage under those circumstances. There are others as well that the church allows for. It's basically the 3 A's: abuse, abandonment, adultery, and death. So 3 AAAD. Add. It is basically the circumstances in which remarriage is permitted. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, abuse seems like it'd be the most ambiguous category there. In some cases, it wouldn't be, but
Right. Well, and usually it would have to be to a certain severity, right? It's like, ideally, those kind of things, and this is something that St. Paul is going to talk about later, not specifically about abuse, but kind of the way to handle that, which would be to separate for a time, work things out, and then get together. So it's with abuse, it's traditionally been handled as it's not kind of a one-off, right? It's like, okay, there needs to be some sort of pattern here, and if there's no desire for repentance, then things start to move in that direction. But the first thing that would happen in that case is separation, and then an attempt to get some reconciliation going and repentance. But if the abuser is not willing to repent and is refusing to acknowledge that they did any wrong, which is unfortunately a very common thing, then things need to happen. That there needs to be a more permanent break in that. And then the others, of course, those are all, abandonment as well. The canons have a certain time period, and that would be like, that was a very common thing for especially the edges of the empire. If there was barbarians who would come in and raid a village, take people, you would lose your people. They could be alive, they could not be. You simply don't know. So that was the most common cause of like abandonment, where it was like the person was forcefully separated. And there was nothing that they could do.
Right.
Of course, there's the less ideal, which is someone just runs away, but that didn't happen as often. Those are all, and they're like we talked about a few weeks ago there with the penances. There are canonical kind of requirements that have to be fulfilled in order for these things to move forward in any certain way. All right, Andrew, do you want to continue us off?
Sure.
We'll do, what is it, 10 through 16?
well, that's a lot. Okay.
Yes, it is. Good luck, Greek boy.
Okay, fine. I'll try in the Greek. I command to those who have been married, not I, but the Lord, for the woman not to be separated from the man. And if she is separated, let her remain unmarried, or let her be reconciled with the man, and let the man not put away the woman. And for the rest, I say, not the Lord, if some brother has a unbelieving wife, and she is pleased to live with him, let him not put her away. And if some woman has a unbelieving husband, and this man is pleased to live with her, let her not put away the man. For the unbelieving man has been sanctified in the woman, and the unbelieving woman has been sanctified in the brother. Since then your children are undefiled, and now they are holy. And if an unbelieving husband is separated, let him be separated. For the brother has not been made a slave, nor the sister in such things as these. And in peace, God has called you. God has called you in peace. For what do you know, woman, if you will save the man, or what do you know, man, if you will save the woman?
Very good. So here St. Paul's continuing, right? He's saying in terms of marital dispute, if the wife decides to leave the husband or the husband decides to leave the wife, the best course of action is to reconcile, is to figure out how to make this work, figure out the source of the problem, work it out, and remain married, right? And then he moves on to the notion of mixed marriages, right? Which is the marriage of a believer and a non-believer, which was a very common it's unfortunately common today as well, but it was very common back then where someone would convert and either just the husband or the wife would convert and the other would remain a pagan, right? And there was kind of a notion among the Corinthians that, well, if that happens, then the marriage is annulled and you should just leave your spouse. And St. Paul's saying that's not a good idea, saying do not do that because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. It is not a good, you should remain married to this person. Why? Because he says, the marriage with an unbeliever could very well sanctify your spouse. In other words, if you live a pious life and you're living in prayer and fasting and you're praying for your spouse, that's going to have an effect on their soul, right? They very well could end up coming to the faith themselves. And so it's not just, you're not just swearing them off and saying, well, goodbye, becoming a Christian, see you later, good luck in your life. He's saying that's not a good idea. Now, on the other hand, if the spouse is unwilling to accept the fact that you're a Christian and decides to leave, you're under no obligation to remain in that marriage, is what St. Paul is saying, right? So if they're just completely incapable of accepting that, which is a very hard decision to make, right? But if they're basically giving you the option, either you apostatize or and we remain married, or I leave. The choice is you have to let them leave, which is a very hard thing to do, right? That's an incredibly difficult decision to be put in. So
I think your practice usually would be less clear cut than that. Like somebody might be unhappy about it, but it wouldn't be that clear cut.
not necessarily.
Oh, is it? Well, it depends on what.
There have been circumstances I've seen even today where that is the there people are given that option.
Right.
You either stay with me or you stay with the church. Those are your two options. It's not incredibly common that it expresses itself in that way very often. Yeah. But that is something that does happen. That's not uncommon. It's not unheard of. Effectively what St. Paul here is saying is you shouldn't allow your faith to be a pretext to leave your spouse, but if they decide to leave, you're under no bond to that person. And it's a sad thing, but that's the reality, right? And then once again, he's rebuking kind of the notion of just vainly leaving your spouse. Saying, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? You simply do not know. You should stay in the marriage for the sake, not only for your own sake and for your own faithfulness, but for the sake of your spouse, because you simply do not know what will happen to them in time. And sometimes these things happen right away. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they simply don't happen. But even that faithfulness, it does something on the soul of the spouse. Your prayers for them, your love for them, that's good. Now, very often nowadays, you will see a situation in which somebody in the church decides to marry somebody outside of the church. And that unfortunately has become common in the U.S. That's a major problem. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, under normal circumstances, that should only happen when there's absolutely no other option. But that's very much becoming commonplace today. I was reading a book, pre-marriage book, was published by an Orthodox jurisdiction, and it effectively said that, like, I think it was 70% of marriages in that jurisdiction were of a mixed nature, where it was an Orthodox person and a non-Orthodox spouse. And it's like, that's not good. It should not be the majority of that's simply just not good. Which is why that's something we were talking about before you got here is ways to meet other Orthodox people, because we live, our parishes are often small. So, like, go to Bible studies to other parishes, especially meet the parents at other parishes, get to know them, because then they'll introduce you to their kids, and it's good. Sometimes you're lucky and blessed, and you meet somebody at the church you're in, and that's really great. But that doesn't always happen to everyone. But that is the ideal place to meet somebody, of course, is in church. So, any thoughts on that? Unless you all want to become monastics, then this is just not relevant to you at all.
Should one be closed off to the idea of dating, well, a non-Orthodox Christian, but or marrying an Orthodox Christian or a Catholic or a Protestant?
So the
Would that be off the
Protestant, at least
table?
in the Protestant world, we called that, when I was a Protestant, flirt to convert.
Well,
And it's a bold move, Cotton. It usually doesn't work out. So it's not like, there are certain instances in which, say, you meet somebody and they're open to the idea of Orthodoxy. You should be clear about your intentions. Like, hey, of course, dating is for marriage. That's what dating is for. If you're not dating with the express purpose to vet somebody out for marriage, you're setting yourself up for trouble. That's just not going to be a relationship that works. But you should be open about that and say, look, I'm an Orthodox Christian. It is ideal to marry an Orthodox Christian. So if you're dating somebody who's like completely opposed to the Orthodox faith, that's just it's a bad idea. You're setting yourself up for failure. Because if they're already hostile to the faith before you get married, just wait till you have kids, and then it's going to be a nightmare. You're setting yourself up for a life of misery. So yeah, it's not necessarily wrong to date somebody who isn't in the church at this time, as long as they're open to it. Or let's say, for example, somebody starts coming to church and they're an inquirer, right? And they seem interested in the faith, but they're not yet Orthodox, right? But that's also not quite what you're saying, I think.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a very circumstantial thing. But this all just boils down to dating needs to be intentional. You need to make your intentions clear and say, dating is for the sake of marriage. I would like to marry an Orthodox Christian. Let's have this conversation. And so that's a bit more upfront flirt to convert. But, yeah. Glad I was able to bring that up at some point. That's a good comment. So anyway, yeah, that's less than ideal, not necessarily wrong. Sometimes should never be done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did once hear an Orthodox priest encourage, dating Catholics just out of
Just control.
no, just because from numerical reasons, I think as a practicality.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, and that's also that is a very common cause of a jurisdiction ending up with like 70% mixed marriages. It's like that kind of mentality. The best thing ultimately is to try and find somebody who's Orthodox, is to go, for example, to the local Greek church and block their Euro cart with a horn hat like a Viking. It's like St. Vladimir. This is just like St. Vladimir, lay siege to the Greek festival and demand a wife. So something like that, it's a bold move, but it could work. It worked with St. Vladimir. It wasn't quite the Greek festival. It was Constantinople, which is like, almost the same thing. So, there are ways to do it, but I think the best thing that we can do is to be familiar with our other local churches, be familiar with the families that are there. And the old ways of finding a spouse are not dead. People think they are. People have tried to turn like exclusively online. That's not, it's not the only way to find a spouse. You can still find a spouse the old way. Arranged marriages still happen. like I said, happened with me. It's like I didn't choose my wife, her aunt did. Her aunt decided I was going to marry her niece, and that's just what happened. And you know, it's not like they forced me. There wasn't like a shotgun wedding. The yayas at the church did threaten me with knives at one point. They said they gave me a deadline where I had to be married, and I met that deadline because they were serious. They were very serious. But that was also after we were dating.
I unfortunately haven't followed up with it yet, but when I went to St. Nick's, I discovered that the Greek way of saying, "Oh, he's single," sounds exactly what you would think of. Oh, still not that single.
Yeah,
And when I went to the Romanian parish, this woman wrapped her arms around me and said, "I am married. I am your future mother." Well, what a coincidence! I'm the future son-in-law.
yeah. Some
I
people
want to
are
be
very
married.
yeah.
So it was just a little bit terrifying.
Yep. Some people are very open, but the beauty of meeting, you know, Lord willing, your future spouse's parents first is they know their children very well, and ideally they have their best interests in mind, and they may be able to sniff out a spouse a little better than their child can, which is what happened in my case. At least my aunt-in-law now was just like, she saw me, she was like, "You're marrying my niece." Didn't tell me that outright, but just kind of pushed us together, and then it did not take long after that. It was like, okay, this is happening. So anyways, okay, I will finish this out now.
Wait, can we go back to verse 9 a little bit? So we translated
Yes.
that before, or we read that as it is better to marry than to burn with passion, right?
Yeah,
Is that you could also translate it as to burn though, right?
that is what it says in King James.
Is that does that mean to burn with passion? Is that what it?
The fathers understand that that's what it means.
Okay.
Because burning with passion will also ultimately lead to burning.
Okay.
Being ensnared to that, it's like a foretaste of the eternal punishment.
So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
'Cause this really sounds a lot less intense if you say burn with passion as opposed to just to burn.
right, right, absolutely. Okay. Let's see. I will read 17 through 24. Okay. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and this uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price, and be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. So here is once again a very self-evident passage, right? Where it's the state in which we are in should be the state we remain in when we are baptized, right? So then he's dealing, of course, in the beginning with the Judaizers, where there was a group of the Jews, the Pharisees, who had been received into the church, who believed that the Gentiles were required to fill the old law, right? So they would follow St. Paul around. St. Paul would baptize people, and then they would say, okay, now that you've been baptized, you need to be circumcised, and you need to follow the law. You need to follow the Old Testament commandments, right? Whereas the Old Testament commandments, the law of Moses that was given, it was given as a sign that Israel was God's chosen people. It was a sign to distinguish them from among the nations as a priestly class to prepare them for the coming of Christ, right? And that sign was first and foremost given in circumcision. Circumcision was a religious act. It is still a religious act that signified their status as other, right? As apart from the world, God's chosen people. And that was also a foretaste of baptism, right? It was the icon, or it was a type of baptism. But when baptism came, the true symbol of one being sealed and a chosen warrior of Christ, circumcision was done away with. So those who were baptized no longer need to be circumcised. Right, nowadays, I mean, in America, this is a very recent phenomenon. The circumcision has become just normal for children, but Christians do not circumcise. We do not. So and if you have a boy child, you have to be incredibly careful because even if you write in 5 different forms and in big letters, do not do this,
Oh.
they will try and do it. They tried to do it with Marty.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the lady even said like, "Oh, I know you marked no, but maybe it was an accident." I was like, "No!" Like grabbed her, like, "Nope. Where are you taking him?" Every nurse, every time they went to take him out, I was like, "Where are you taking him?" And a few were gonna go and try and do it. I was like, "No."
I mean, that's good. That's good to know. If well,
Like, imagine
Yeah.
somebody immigrates to America, loves everything, and then like they have a kid and go, wait, what?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's it's a big problem because it's become so commonplace today. But it's like there are many religious things that exist in American life where we just don't see it that way. But circumcision has always been fundamentally a religious practice that is no longer done. It is no longer practiced by the church, right? Because the church is Israel. The circumcision was a sign that Israel was God's chosen people, but now it is baptism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, St. Paul's Day, the Jewish Christians would have continued doing it, though. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Jewish Christians remained circumcised. They remained following the law, right? That was what they
Yeah.
continued doing. And that was a decision they made in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, was those who were circumcised would still continue to follow the law of Moses, whereas those who were of the Gentiles who were received, all that was required of them was not to eat food offered to idols, not to eat blood, and not to eat strangled animals, and not to engage in fornication. These were the things they were called not to do that would distinguish them from the rest of the world.
Are we supposed to not eat blood? Is that
Yeah.
like okay, something like black pudding?
Yeah, that's like the only instance in which you would find it in our culture, which is disgusting anyway.
I know it's really good. I love it.
Is it really? Well, I'm sorry to tell you.
I can't eat it.
No, Christians do not eat blood. So yeah, that is the only dietary restriction that Christians have outside of the fasting, of course. But
I'm so serious.
No, it's really tasty. Black pudding. Yeah.
What better to like? Your priest just said you can't do it.
Right.
But even like medium well steaks,
That's not blood.
that's not blood.
but it's bloody.
It looks like it's not
It
blood.
appears to be bloody, but it is not blood. It is the connective tissue in the meat that's just being released, and the juice is in there.
But it's like it's an English black pudding, but it's an English breakfast thing that we didn't make it, but I think it's got like oats in it or something, but it's made with the actual pig blood.
Yeah, it's
It's
congealed
really-
blood. It's
yeah, it's really good.
like encased in sausage.
I
It's
know. I just finished watching Dracula. Is there something wrong about this?
I've never had it. It's always been something that I thought was disgusting. And then when I was a Protestant, I read Acts, and it was like, oh, Gentiles can't eat blood. Oh, thank God.
It's an
Like,
important-
I
it's an
can
important part
excuse
of
myself.
an English breakfast, right?
Yeah, which I've always thought to be interesting because they're a Christian people traditionally.
Yeah.
So I've always wanted to look into the history of black pudding, but then again, I've also been told that most of much of the British culinary tradition is penance from breaking away from Rome. That's what I've been told. I don't know. I can neither confirm nor deny that, but that was a joke I was told once, but I thought it was very funny.
What's that no flavor of sheep stuff?
Right. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, so ultimately the status in which we are received. So like he's saying, if you're baptized and you are a slave, it is of course better to be free, but know you are free in Christ. So don't like rebel against your master. But then if you're received as a freeman, you're a servant of Christ. And then we read in Philemon, right, which is one of the shorter epistles in the New Testament. St. Paul is calling for this Christian. So he was a slave owner, right, and one of his slaves who was also baptized fled, and he's calling for him to free the man because they're both brothers in Christ, right? So that's we can see here and once again a very radical departure from the way things were done throughout the history of the world. Those who were received into the church were all viewed on the same level, and so those who were received who had slaves, the slaves should be freed. A very different concept of what existed. And then it took, the secular world a very long time to catch up. Like almost 2,000 years. Like, but well, and even today there's still slavery, but even Christian nations took a very long time for these things to catch up.
What was the reason why you were?
Oh, which ritual laws remain for Christians? Which Jewish
Yeah.
laws
Okay.
remain?
Yeah, so when in the book of Acts, when it was decided what the Gentiles were supposed to do, the only dietary restriction was not to eat of blood. So
Yeah, why?
why? Because the blood is the life of the animal.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, that's always been the case. So in the sacrifices of the old temple, the Lord said, you know, it's you're offering the life to the Lord, and that is the Lord's portion. Whereas the priest would eat the meat, but the blood belonged to the Lord, which was a type, right, of Christ's sacrifice. He's giving his life for who himself is life, so that we may live. So that's what that is. That type of sacrifice. And it's even true today. So like priests can't work as a butcher. We can't kill animals. We're in that position.
Not at all. Like
No.
there was like a rat or something in the house.
I would have to look into that. But you know, like we aren't permitted to like kill our own food, basically, as priests.
Yeah.
Because we serve the blood with sacrifice. When it comes to a rat, I mean, that's what the cats are for. They'll take
Right,
care.
yeah,
I'm not going to end up like strangling a rat. I'm not going to end up engaging like physically with a rat. That's just not going to be.
I was wondering if it was like
so.
restricted to like hunting and like that kind of thing, or if it's no context with you.
I would have to look into that for further detail.
It's
But
not just curious, not super important.
right, yeah, it's yeah. So we don't hunt, we don't work as butchers. That's something that priests do. There are dispensations for that for like rural areas. Like if you're a priest living in the middle of nowhere and you need to hunt to live, your main source of protein in the winter is like a deer or something like that. That's a different
Got
story.
it, okay.
But like for us, I mean, we have Kroger. We have a grocery store, so it's, yeah, we're about to have Aldi, which is great.
Okay, so the attitude is still very different from the Jewish attitude, where if there's a strong reason for it, it would be permitted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
So
all of
it's
these
not
all of
blood
these
pudding.
things are there are very few hard and fast rules. There are always exceptions to those rules, which is a very difficult thing to understand in today's day and age. We like things to be clear cut. But almost always, like even with canon law is a misnomer. That's the ideal that we are to strive by, but there are times in which that can be flexed for the salvation of the person due to weakness or whatever. So yeah, that's an ideal that we strive for, but there are circumstances in which
Andrew,
we can get around it.
parting with blood pudding is a little bit too much. My great grandma from the UP has an amazing parsley recipe. I have improved on this awesome recipe. We'll give you the recipe, and we will not miss blood pudding.
Is it made of blood? Is it a blood pasty?
No, it's made of Creole and love.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, where are we at?
Rice folded dough. Oh,
We're at 25, right?
Yes.
17.
25. No, we're on 25. All right. Well, I have this section as 25 through 40. So, Charles, do you want to read us all the way to the end of this chapter?
Yeah, I'm
A lot.
glad you didn't take me for that.
That's right. I was afraid. Like 17 through 40. Go for it.
Okay, sure.
25. 25 through 40.
Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good, because the present distress, and it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have troubles in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing. For the form of this world is passing away. We want to pause to try to digest.
We can pause. We can stop. There's a lot there.
Anyone want to pause? I'm just gonna-
Does anyone have any thoughts? There's a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just-
Does the OSB have any footnotes on that? Any
Um,
footnotes on this section?
The
What does it say?
present distress probably refers to the trials and tribulations of the largest and glorious Christ spoke because.
For what?
You could read it out loud.
All right, let me
'Cause we don't have that.
Um, I suppose therefore that it was good because of the present distress that it is good for a man to rejoice as he is. Let's see. First, the present distress probably refers to what it says, probably refers to the trials and tribulations of life just before the glorious coming of Christ, which Paul perceived as imminent. And
Yep.
the next one isn't until the next.
Oh, and then it also says,
Yeah.
Though Paul's counsel is a preferred option, not a command. Keeping the commandments of God is what matters.
Very good. Yeah. So he's saying that once again, he's here outlining the case for virginity. And this was also something that was radically different from the pagan world. This is something that St. Athanasios points to in confirming the truth of Christianity is the prominence of virginity and the ideal of virginity in as opposed to married life. So anyways,
Especially for men.
Right.
You guys think like vessels with virgins for women, but
well, it was both for men and women,
Yeah.
but at the beginning, especially at the time of St. Athanasios, I mean, there wasn't a place in the monasteries for women. If a woman was a virgin, she tended to stay at home. She tended to live out her ascesis in the home, connected to a parish church. But so the beginning of monasticism was a male endeavor of men fleeing the world. And then there were then what would happen was some women would come and they would dress as male monks and disguise themselves and live in the monasteries in that way. And eventually that just became an untenable position. And so convents were established too. And this was all fairly, it didn't take long. It wasn't like there was hundreds of years of women disguising as monks. It was, probably 1 to 2 decades. And then they were like, okay, we're going to establish convents here. So anyways, keep reading.
But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, that has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by I'll keep on going. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only to the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, as I think I also have the Spirit of God.
So here, is the most vivid portrayal of marriage and virginity in St. Paul's writings, and outlining the superiority of virginity to married life. That doesn't mean that married life is wrong. It simply means that there is a good way and a better way. Marriage is good and it is blessed by God, but wholly devoting oneself to the Lord without worldly care is even better. Does that make sense? Which is why we're reading this all at once. I mean, it is a fairly straightforward passage. And Archbishop of Verki, he talks about it. He says in chapter 7, verses 25 through 40, St. Paul vividly makes the case for virginity. Virgins are freed from the present distress, meaning the sorrows and troubles connected with marital life, which are many and varied. The short duration of the earthly life and the imminence of the second coming should inspire Christians to such an inner disposition in which those who have wives should be as though they had none. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord, but he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, as St. Paul said. Married life has many cares that hinder one from completely pleasing the Lord and even distract from service to God. Therefore, it is better to remain a virgin, although if someone does get married, they have not committed sin. So in married life, there are things that happen. There are things that we have to do. There are services that we have to render that make it difficult to live as if we are not married, right? So the monastics, for example, they have 7 cycles of services every day. They go through the entire Psalter in a week, sometimes twice a week, and that's just the public reading of the Psalter. Sometimes they'll read it as well in their own cell. So some monastics will read the Psalter 3+ times a week, all of the Gospels on a weekly basis, things like that. So there are things in which monastics are capable of doing that are just not tenable for those in the world. And that's important for us to recognize, right? I mean, we'll read, for example, the lives of the saints, how certain saints read the Psalter every day or something, like St. Patrick of Ireland, right? That was his prayer rule. He read the entire Psalter and he did 1,000 prostrations. That's a very incredible thing. Now, somebody in the world might read that and decide, I'm going to also do that. But what happens if you have kids? You can't do that. You have to tend to your children. You have to tend to the needs of your children. You have to tend to the needs of your wife, right? You need to work in order to support your family. Whether that be the husband or the wife doing it, it doesn't matter. There needs to be, you need to be concerned with those things. So you have layers of responsibility that are present that are not present if you are celibate. That doesn't mean it's bad. It simply means that it's different. That makes sense? And that's a very common thing that we'll see. Like you see that tension throughout the history of the church, and then you see that tension coming out a lot today. I mean, there's very much a very negative view of marriage, especially online. Effectively, it's and that's in reaction to a much more worldly and hedonistic understanding of marriage that our culture has really propagated. But you see that kind of creeping into Christianity as well, and this denigration of marriage, which, it is a beautiful thing. What is required for marriage? Well, once again, this is something that Father Gregory talked about. May have been in his homily. I think it was last week when he talked about Christianity and politics, how neither party really represents the gospel. It's the same thing with culture. There is always a point at which culture is at odds with the gospel. So there's never really been a point at which our culture has had an orthodox understanding of marriage, right, and how that works out. So now, we're called to live this married life, but that's not going to look like the world. And so we also should not seek guidance from the world as well. That's going to lead to a disaster. Even though you will get it unmitigated, Lord willing, all of you end up getting married if you decide it, or you all become monks. I have no idea. But you'll get advice from everyone on how to live a married life, and it's pretty easy to tell which of it needs to be rejected. I mean, you're going to hear things that are just awful. And there's it makes it leaves. If you've ever wondered why families get divorced, the moment you get ready to be married and you receive unmitigated advice from everyone, any of that doubt or wonder goes out the window, and you understand why. is just the way the world understands marriage is very different than the Christian understanding. And if you're struggling to live the Christian ideal of marriage, marriage is a wonderful thing and it's a beautiful thing. It is not something that is miserable. But that being said, in order for that to happen, it requires the narrow way of living the Christian life. It's hard. It's sacrificial. As I was told when I was preparing for marriage, marriage is a crown or is a cross upon which flowers occasionally bloom. So it's a beautiful thing, but it is a sacrificial thing. It's a sacrificial thing, and it's important to keep that in mind. And that's what St. Paul is kind of saying here, right? It's marriage is this thing that we have to sacrifice for, and in that sacrifice, it hinders us from living a life totally devoted to the evangelical virtues. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. So the life of total abandonment to God, of celibacy, is not for everyone, right? It's in fact, it's not for most. Any thoughts on that?
Did Jesus ever perform the sacrament in church ever, or?
Well, he blessed the marriage in Cana, in Galilee. He was there. That was his first miracle, turning the water into wine. So, but he himself did not form a marriage, like celebrate a marriage himself or officiate, if that's what you're asking. But he did bless that marriage, and the church has always understood that as a sign that the Lord blesses marriage and that it's a good and holy thing.
So how does the church come up with their own process?
Well,
With the symbols and the
very much everything that we have, our worship, it was established in the garden in a very simple way, but is simply continued to develop as the Lord has continued to reveal himself to us, right? So much of our marriage stuff comes from that temple worship that the apostles were involved in with the Jews right before Christ came. But then Christ came, so they took those things and simply continued practicing them in a Christian context. So the marriage service itself, I mean, it's a very ancient service. I don't know if there are any other extant services that would have been practiced. I would have to look into that. So the rite itself, the rite of marriage, I'm not entirely sure if there existed at any point any other rite. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now there is a second, and there's a different rite for a first marriage, a second marriage, and a third marriage. But there's also a new rite of marriage that actually was created at fall of Soviet Union, when we had a ton of people entering into the church who had civil unions, but never been blessed by the church. And so that's a different service that the church has established. But that is basically based on the other marriage services. Does that make sense? That one doesn't happen too much, but it does happen. Yeah, so I would have to look into that more. I'm sure somebody much smarter than I am has done a lot of research into this and has probably written a book. So
There's probably many books.
there's probably many books on it. Now the question is, are those books in English? Because there's a lot of material. You understand Russian to some degree, right? So I'm willing to bet you some seminarian in Russia somewhere probably has written about this. If there isn't a book in English, I'll look into it. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to look into. So.
And is any form of marriage, is there a degree of holiness to it? If it's like a signed marriage, if it's a marriage in a different church, if it's a marriage in a Buddhist temple, is a marriage still just a marriage?
So for those coming into the church who are already married outside of the church recognizes that marriage, and the grace of the marriage is given upon reception of the church, right? It's like, so what we would view for those marriages outside of the church is it is lacking something as long as the people are not living a godly life, as long as they're not living a life according to God's commandments. Then God is not in the marriage, right? Because a Christian marriage is founded on sacrificial love, on the love of Christ. And so if you don't have that in the marriage, it's not the same thing. Yeah, but we don't remarry people when they enter into the church. Does that make sense?
And it would be wrong to, I mean, it would be wrong, it's St. Paul says it'd be wrong to put someone open to leave somebody once you enter the church.
Right.
So that sense, marriage must be real, right?
Yeah, the marriage is real. I mean, we acknowledge that is a, but its sacramental nature is something unique to the church. So when we enter into the church and have this union blessed by God, that's a very different thing. But yeah, I mean, St. Paul here saying, don't leave your unbelieving spouse, that means that the marriage means something. And that the believing spouse has the capacity by living a Christian life to sanctify the rest of the family. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's a good question. And the Russian church had to deal with that pretty extensively. Hey, buddy. Good night, buddy. Love you. Goodbye.
Sleep well.
Yeah, so like the Russian church had to deal with this at the fall of the Soviet Union. Like I said, I mean, there was a lot of people who had been baptized as babies secretly at some point in their life, but then they had gotten civil marriages. Good night, McGreen. I love you, sweet pea. Good night, honey. God bless you. Good night, baby. Yeah, so this was a big pastoral issue. Was like, how do we handle all of these people coming in who had civil unions but not a church wedding? And even in Russia today, there are parts of Russia in which the state doesn't recognize a church marriage. You still need to go to the court and get what Americans would call a courthouse wedding, right? So the church has handled that in such a way that it acknowledges civil unions for those coming into the church, that's an acceptable form of marriage. But for those in the church, if they're living a life of the church and they get a civil union but not a church marriage, that's a problem. That's an issue. Which is why the church established the right of those who have been living together for so many years but haven't gotten a church wedding. Which is different, than the other marriage services. It's basically like, it's very penitential in nature. You're basically asking God, you're basically asking for forgiveness for them neglecting their duty to get this thing blessed by God. Yeah. So, did that answer your question? Okay, good. That's good. Very good. Yeah, she acts like nobody's ever paid attention to her ever. All right, so it is almost 8:30. So we could try and make it through this next chapter, or we could just hold off until next week. It's only 13 verses.
Either way.
It's all one section. We could hold off. We could keep going. Up to you all. Let's do it. Okay, we'll do it. Very good. Who wants to read?
Okay,
All right, Elizabeth.
to where?
Let's see. That's a good question.
You can stop me.
Yeah, we'll just stop as we see it, because this one is very much one section. It's all very much it's all connected. Okay, so yeah, just start reading.
Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have to know. We all have to knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet, as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one.
We can stop there real quick. So idols. What are idols?
Images of gods.
Images of gods. Do they have any power? Andrew's thinking.
Well, the demons have power.
Demons have power. So what does it say in the Psalms? All the gods of the Gentile or the heathen are. You just said the word. The demons.
Oh, yes.
All
right,
the
okay,
gods
okay,
of the heathen are demons, right? So
yeah.
so yeah, the idols are some of the idols are demonic, right? Some of them are simply inert. But even then, the idol itself is an inert thing. It's so a really good Wisdom of Sirach, which is in the Old Testament. A lot of it is focused on idolatry, and it is really wonderful. It really it exposes the absurdity of idolatry and what exactly you're doing when you engage in idolatry really, really well. And I would highly recommend reading it. But it's very much relevant to us today, right? Because an idol also is anything that we give precedence to over God, anything that we venerate or worship over God. And that, whether we realize it or not, there are still a lot of idols today. They may not necessarily be statues. They may have screens that light up and have various different things on them. But that's neither here nor there. So yeah, an idol is an inert thing, but they are very often tools used by the demons to keep people distracted. And at this time, there was many gods. But what ultimately the Lord is or what St. Paul is saying here is that we know that there is only one God. The pagans believed that their idol was a god, but there were other gods. There was a pantheon of gods. But we know that there's only one, right? So he's saying we know there's only one God. These idols are nothing. They may be demonic, but they're not gods. Like God is God. They are a different thing. Okay. Andrew, do you want to read or do you want to continue reading? Okay.
All right, well, I can read either way.
Switch into the King James. Where's your other Bible?
It's here. No, it's here. It's here.
Okay.
Sure. Well,
Just
where
gonna keep it in my
are we
notes.
picking? Where are we picking up? 5.
Verse 5.
Okay. Well, for if there are so-called gods either in heaven or on earth, just as there are many gods and many lords, nevertheless, for us, there's one God, the Father, from whom all things are, and we are to Him. And one Lord Jesus Christ, with whom all things and ourselves are through him. But knowledge is not in all, and some even up till now eat food offered to idols by the custom of the idol. We need to switch.
You're making the switch.
Yeah, and their awareness. I don't know what's it on.
Conscience.
Conscience.
Their conscience being weak is defiled.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we can stop there. So
I'll
he's,
open up my King James.
so he's saying, right, that we know that there is one Lord Jesus Christ, that this is God, that there is one God, but there are those even in the church who still struggle with a notion that maybe God is one God among other gods. He is perhaps greater than the other gods, but they still kind of view those gods as such, as gods. Maybe little gods, like lowercase g. They still view them as such. And as such, eating food offered to them, they see as a sacramental kind of thing, as union with that God, right? So that's something that wounds their conscience. Whereas St. Paul says, we are free. We know that that this is nothing. And we'll continue reading about what that says, so you can keep reading.
Okay, but meat commendeth not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. For if any man see thee which hath knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things that are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend.
Right. Any thoughts on that? This is a very important Christian maxim. Very important. I mean, what he's saying here is we are free. We are totally free as Christians, but that freedom is not a freedom to do something that would cause our brother to stumble. Right? So you may know that the idol is nothing, that there is only one God. And in that freedom, you may choose to eat that food that's offered to idols because you know it's offered to nothing. But if there are those around you in the church who don't have that same knowledge, they may be led astray and think that they can eat the food offered to idols and think that there is some legitimacy in that God, right? And so that would cause a stumbling block to your brother. That's a wound to their conscience. And so St. Paul is saying, you know, just because we are free as Christians doesn't mean we can do whatever we want. We have to be aware of how these things will impact our brothers and sisters in Christ. Does that make sense? We have to be conscious of our actions and be sure not to offend the weaker ones among us, right? So that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind. And you see that throughout the entire history of the church. The entire history of the church has very much followed this maxim. Like, for example, with the canon of Scripture, we've talked about this a few times. The canon has changed over time. There have been books that have been that at one point the New Testament was much larger than it is now, right? But there were some who simply could not fathom or could not bear the notion that maybe those who were the disciples of the apostles as well could write divinely inspired books. And so the church, recognizing that it is better to not wound the conscience of the weaker, remove those books from the canon. Said that they're not saying that they're not good books. They relegated them to useful books to be read, but for the sake of those who were weaker among them, who could only accept certain books, they reduced the size of the canon, right? So these other books. So this is something, and that's just as an example in the canon, but you see this throughout the Christian life. You even see this through the way we live as Christians. You see this as an example how we live as husband and wife in marriage. This is something St. John Chrysostom talks about. The spiritual life of the family should be dictated by the weaker one, by the weaker spouse. There will be times in which one spouse wants to do something and the other is simply not able to do it. That means neither of you are doing that thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And this is also true with our friends, our loved ones, whatever. We need to condescend to the weakness of others for their sakes and for our sakes as well. It humbles us. It allows us to practice humility. So we're not doing what we're doing out of pride, right? If we just say, well, this person can't pray as much as I can and we're together, well, forget him, I'm just going to keep going, right? That puffs us up. That makes us prideful. But if we acknowledge, okay, maybe this person can't pray like I can, but they still want to pray as much as they can pray. And in that way, you're praying, you're humbling yourself, you're restricting yourself for the sake of your brother or your sister. This is a really wonderful thing. And it's the same, and this is how the church operates as well as a whole. It's always better to condescend and avoid scandal than it is to just go on and under the pretext of Christian freedom, do something that would cause other people in the church to freak out. Does that make sense?
Is St. Paul also here talking about demons as well, though, when he talks about many gods, or is that all just people think there are many gods, but is he allowing there's some degree of reality to that?
Yeah, I mean, so what he's saying is we know that those aren't gods. We know that they're demons. We know that they have no power. We know that they are powerless in the face of the cross. The cat just attack you.
Yeah, he did. So he
Man.
got booted off.
Yep, banished. So bad cat. Go away. So yeah, it's I think that's ultimately what he is alluding to, is that these are demonic beings, but those in the church know that when faced with the cross, they're powerless. But there may be some who don't have that same knowledge, who may have some doubt or some misunderstanding. And so if they see you behaving in such a way in a temple that would to them gives credence to the pagan gods, that may lead them to some sort of syncretism, right? Some sort of ecumenism that's just not acceptable. Does that make sense? Any other thoughts on that?
There's a textual variant for conscience versus habit in verse
Oh, really?
7. Yeah. That says, yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure it matters, but
In like a footnote?
no, actually, so this Greek text actually fits, so it has, I think, has a different text than the King James.
Huh.
Yeah,
Interesting.
like if you see here,
and some and some eat food offered to idols with the habit or with the custom up till now of the idol, versus this is conscience in, I think, King James has it.
Cynthia.
Wait, what was it? Synedesis, right? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's habit.
Yeah.
But then it's Synedesi.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm not sure if it affects the meaning all that much. Well, a little bit.
Right.
But he's emphasizing that in this way that they're mired in the habit of idols.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think both are acceptable. Both are. You're not. There's no contradiction there.
No.
Interesting.
Quite interesting. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Seeing a different edition, you're like, wait,
Yeah.
no, this is that.
Same kind of thing.
This is why at St. Nick's it took like a decade
Yeah.
to make it through the whole
I would
Bible.
say this is the
It's just-
first time I brought up a textual variant.
That is
held
true.
off-
I've held off like many times before.
That is true. If we were at St. Nick's, this
Yeah.
might take a lot longer.
I've
So
been restraining myself.
that's good for the weaker among us who are, we speak American. Well, and some of us speak a little Greek too, but not as much as you. All right. Well, does anyone else have any questions, comments, or concerns? My Greek this week was learning the itsy bitsy spider
That's a good one.
in Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, you know much more modern Greek than I do.
I'm learning modern Greek because my daughter is learning modern Greek. So we're getting there.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's a spider is important.
It's very important. Yeah, it's very important. Then
Wait,
there's
what
another
is it-
one.
What is it in modern Greek?
Oh.
Or ancient Greek, if you know what an ancient Greek. Is it Arachne or something?
Yeah, I think it's Tamikro and Anakri or something like that. Yeah, I would have to look at it again. I read it and was like, that's nice, and then put it away. It does not translate well to the song. Only the first line you can do, and then after that it completely falls apart. Then the words get huge. And it's
Oh,
like, oh no, this is way too many consonants for this to fit. Way too many. But yeah, it's good. So
That's funny.
Actually, I do kind of. I mean, it titles here "Love Reigns Over Knowledge," but then it talks about idols, but then it didn't really mention love over knowledge.
what do you mean?
Like it just titled the entire passage really that love reigns over knowledge, but the whole thing was talking about idols and not so much about
You should have been called against the generation of.
Well, I think what that means is that, what St. Paul is saying is that we may know that these idols aren't actually gods, but for the sake of those among us who don't know that, we refrain from doing things that would cause them to lose their conscience. And that's an act of love, right? So you could just tell the person, well, you're an idiot. Like, how do you not know this thing? That's not going to do anyone any good, right? So it's better for us to, out of love, do a thing for the sake of those who may not know as much as we do, instead of trying to bash them over the head with our knowledge. That's not useful to anyone. Yeah. Unless Andrew finds any other textual variants, then we should pray.
Well, I could look.
Okay, you look if you want. Well, look after we pray.
Okay,
That's right.
It is truly me to bless you, the Theotokos, ever blessed, most blameless, and Mother of our God, more honorable than charity, beyond compare, glorious, and seraphim, who are corruption, gave us birth, by God, the Word, the very Theotokos, is united.
All right.
We make pretty good